Hey, good morning, everyone. I've got a really awesome must-see interview between Dr. Nasha Winters on the Kick the Sugar Summit, and incredible author of this book that she wrote called The Metabolic Approach to Cancer. I absolute must read. It's a recommend, and you will see why in this interview. She lights a fire under me every time I watch her in an interview. And her expertise and her knowledge in beating cancer. She's a cancer survivor herself from stage 4 ovarian cancer at 19 years of age. And this is a must-see for everyone out there, male or female. So please, watch this video. It's about an hour long. It's incredible. I did not conduct it myself, but it was so important that I wanted to record it to get it out there for you. And man, I encourage you to get the book. I'll leave a link down below that you can purchase it. I am an Amazon affiliate, so it does help me out when you purchase it through my link. So thank you if you choose to do that. But it's an incredible read, and you'll see why when she addresses it in the video, toward the end of the video. But yeah, if you know anyone who has cancer, tumors, or whatever, forward this video to them as a springboard for hope on their path to healing and wholeness. And I appreciate it, and I hope y'all enjoy. Thanks again.
Everybody, back to the Kick Sugar Summit, Season 4. Today we have with us Dr. Nasha Winters. And Dr. Winters is a naturopathic doctor specializing in integrative oncology. And she has a story of recovery from cancer herself. At the age of 19, she was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer and given months to live. She managed clearly to recover and went on to study all of the various different complex pieces that need to come together to allow people to avoid cancer as well as to recover from it. She's the author that was recently published book called The Metabolic Approach to Cancer. Welcome, Nasha.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here, and I'm really honored to be part of the 4th summit. I've followed you for years, so this is really exciting to be part of this. Thank you.
Thank you. My first question is, why don't you tell us a little bit about your journey through cancer and what you've learned about nutrition and cancer and sugar?
Sure. You know, I was a latchkey kid growing up in the 80s, and that meant a lot of processed, easy to go to food, a lot of boxed cereals. My brother and I would notoriously ingest a half a baggie of really bad white bread covered in margarine and cinnamon and sugar, probably not even real cinnamon at that time. That was our after school snack. And often, many times, even breakfast, lunch, and dinner in our household. Coming from kind of a poverty-stricken environment as well, my mom would buy these 50-pound bags of potatoes and 50-pound bags of onions, and we lived on a lot of fried potatoes and onions with ketchup, of course, not homemade, which meant loads of high fructose corn syrup and other things. So my diet, as you can see, from a very young age was pretty processed, pretty carbohydrate dense, very sugar dense. And in our household, we celebrated all events around sugar. You know, like my mom had a little extra money, so we'd buy Fruit Loops instead of, Cheerios, like that was a big special. Or on the weekend, she'd buy day-old donuts, and we'd nuke them in the microwave, buried in that country crock butter. And it's not a surprise that I had a lot of health issues popping right into this world. So because of that, because of poverty, because of the nature of just what we had to do to survive, or my mom working several jobs, we were kind of on our own doing the best that we could. And our friends would come over, they loved coming to our house, boxes of sugary cereals and cinnamon toast. So fast forward of years, literally came out of the womb with digestive issues, started my menstrual cycle at 9. Talk about weird, messed up chemistry. My first bout of cervical cancer at 14, again at 16, and then later ovarian cancer at 19. We weren't taught to do anything differently except for laser it, cut it out, nuke it, do whatever you have to do. So I wasn't thinking in terms of what I could do to support my health until my health was completely, frankly, taken away from me. By the time they figured out, after a year in and out of ERs, pretty much a couple times a month, treated more like a histrionic teenage young woman, I finally was able to get a doctor who did a full-up workup when they realized I was an end organ stage, 9 liters of fluid, almost 9 liters of fluid in my abdomen. When they realized I was at end stage 4 ovarian cancer, mets to my liver, peritoneal cavity, carcinomatosis, and in a huge grapefruit-sized tumor on my right ovary. I was so sick and so far down the rabbit hole at that time, they couldn't offer treatment. So, that quick story of kind of helping you get a landscape of where I'd come from doesn't really surprise anybody to recognize how weak and broken my system was. And no wonder it became like a welcome mat for a really chronic, severe disease process that was sort of ignored and misunderstood and misdiagnosed for a period of time. But I also didn't have the resources to even handle a conventional approach. So sometimes when you're offered nothing, the world is your oyster, right? So for me, it led me on a place of making me really choose that I wanted to live, number one. And also because I was a scientist at heart from a very young age, I started researching. I was in pre-med in medical school in undergrad, and I started researching everything I could. And that's when I accidentally stumbled upon the work in 1991 of Otto Warburg, and started understanding chronic disease and cancer in particular as a metabolic disease, not a genetic disease, despite the fact that there was cancer smattered all over my family of origin, and despite the fact that we were still a good 5-6 years out before I would learn that I also had the BRCA mutation, which is another component of all of this as well. So that's what led me on this journey. And my first sort of foray into this is, I think your listeners will find out how funny this is. I decided at 16 to become a vegetarian. I laugh because a vegetarian in Kansas, my grandmother actually said to me, God put cattle on this earth for a reason, which was basically so we could shove them into feedlots and eat them. I mean, that was, my grandmother worked for MBPXL, which was the largest meat packing corporation in the world, as their bookkeeper for 50 years. So, that was a shock. I was such the black sheep to choose to go into that type of a dietary choice. But let me tell you what I ate. I ate iceberg lettuce, Velveeta cheese, Vlasic dill pickles on white Wonder Bread. Nothing about that had any life value whatsoever. So there are loads of people out there thinking they're eating well for themselves, but it's more contrived, let's put it that way. So my first foray after this diagnosis was a man I was dating, who later became my husband, started sneaking little bits of vegetable matter into my boxed mac and cheese or into my packaged ramen noodles. And I thought it was blasphemy. I wasn't, I'm into that. So here we are, fast forward almost 28 years later, and the journey I've taken of applying and trying all dietary approaches on myself first, as one of my patients calls it, save your ass university. That's what I had to go into at that time. I started out vegetarian. Then I moved to strict vegan after my diagnosis for 7 years. 2 of those years I was a raw food vegan, and I got progressively sicker and sicker and sicker and sicker. My improvement, however, was that I actually started bringing in vegetable matter into the mix, which was the first time in my 19, 20 years on the planet. So I made a lateral improvement initially, but then my body didn't have the nutrients, the base camp nutrients to rebuild and repair my body. And it would still take until about 2010, my in and out forays with playing with grain-free, vegetarian, paleo, all these different things I tried on for size. But because I'm a scientist at heart, I tested all along the way. And I have labs going all the way back to 1991, and I get them run once or twice a year today to show what worked best for me at any given time. So for instance, at almost 48 years old, we did 21 vials of blood a week ago, got the results back. And frankly, they're the healthiest labs I have ever seen for myself in all of these years. And in about 2010, my husband and I finally said, enough of it. We're pulling grains, we're pulling legumes. I had RA, polycystic ovarian syndrome, endometriosis, 3 times with cancer, celiac disease, loads of autoimmune issues, cystic acne, 50 pounds over the weight I am right now. All of these things were happening by me trying to eat this clean vegetarian or vegan lifestyle. It wasn't working for me because it was a carbitarian lifestyle, and it was loaded with a lot of legumes and whatnot that were triggering off a lot of autoimmune reactions in my body. So when I made that shift in 2010, the lights started getting brighter in my whole being. So I know that was a huge backdrop to your story, but I want your listeners to understand this is a journey. It's not an event. And luckily, the information I had to learn through all of those years for myself, we now have a lot of wiser, smarter people and a lot more research and a lot more ability to test, assess, and address and treat individually more than ever before. So you don't have to take 27 and a half years to figure out what works for you, right? We've gotten so much further down the road when that, thanks to things like your summits and thanks to funding into the proper research into proper nutrition. So those are where I want folks to kind of get a sense of where to start. That I don't think there's one size fits all in any dietary approach. And we started into that conversation a bit before the conversation, before you started recording.
Yes, that's amazing. Oh, that's incredible. What I find shocking, and I didn't know this about your story, is that you did manage to heal your cancer, to save your life. So at 19, however many years it took you to end the cancer, but you still had other, like, it wasn't like healing, whatever you did to heal the cancer didn't heal all the other things. I just assumed it did.
Yeah, it took me a while to figure that out. I was able to stabilize the cancer and I was able to slow things down because still the common theme that I had through the whole process was low sugar. I got rid of sugar from the get-go, okay, of any processed sugar, and really limited my fruit intake and really limited anything extra like dates or honey or like those really left the building. But we didn't have like chronometer or MyFitnessPal to realize that that was such an improvement in my health that I was likely eating somewhere between 600 and 1,000 grams a day of sugar at the time of my diagnosis.
Wow.
When I switched more over to frankly becoming a real food diet versus my weird processed food diet, that by nature lowered the amount of food I needed to feel satiated. Because when you're eating a more nutrient-dense real food, you're not as hungry. And I was leaning more on real foods. Mostly, I've started really incorporating a lot of vegetables. That in and of itself adds a lot of fiber, also satiates you, also helps kick up the way your body processes sugar. And also was starting to bring in some cofactors. Some of those green leafy vegetables and whatnot started bringing in much needed cofactors for my body to do all of its enzymatic processes right. That was the good news. The bad news is I still had quite a layer cake on top of it of things that were still in the building. So when I really started when I looked at the way I used to eat, as a vegetarian, I was averaging between 300 and 400 grams of sugar a day when I made improvements. Okay. And that was just trying to get my protein needs met with legumes and grains at that time. So even with that, with me getting enough protein, I had like 10 times the amount of carbohydrate that I needed. So I kept learning. And the biggest strategy for me that made the biggest difference was actually when I didn't eat. I was one of the early adopters back in the early 90s. In fact, I was so sick when I first got diagnosed that I went almost 2 months without eating. And partially because I didn't have any room. I had ascites that kept pulling out the fluid and kept loading up in me, the fluid. So the nature that probably saved me the most was fasting. That's what I pulled out of the building. And that started kicking off all kinds of detox processes. Autophagy started changing some epigenetic expression, started lowering inflammation, started taking the burden out of all those things I kept putting in that just kept pushing my, cytokines and my immune system reactions, and gave me kind of a break and a fast forward and made room in my abdominal cavity that when I did start to eat again, the ascites stayed away. Fluid buildup started to stay away for longer and longer periods of time. And I started to eat more real food. And so today where I am is kind of helping people see the common denominator that's a good anti-cancer diet, which is low glycemic across the board. That fits your whole summit right here. Vegetable matter. We talked about this before as well, because there are definitely people successfully reversing obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease with even a strict carnivore diet. But there's a different personality when it comes to cancer cell metabolism. And we need to test, assess, and address and adjust accordingly. We don't make any guesses. And so I was telling you before the show, I've had a few patients who've successfully used short periods of time, pure carnivore diets to help mitigate some brain tumor activity. But short and sweet is the key, because over periods of time, they start to stimulate other gluconeogenesis, mTOR, insulin growth factor, insulin. They start to kick up a lot of other, like uric acid levels start to come up, oxidative stress, ammonia buildup. These things start to happen in this population because there's a different metabolic process happening in those cancer cells versus the non-cancer cells. And so I think that some of I might sound very different than a lot of your summit speakers because I'm talking about a very particular chemistry, very particular metabolic system, and a very particular patient population. So please keep that in mind while we're talking about this. But I think if we look still that low carbohydrate, above the ground, dense nutrient, leafy greens and whatnot are very important for the cancering patient, and keeping it very low glycemic. And my cancer patients typically remove all grains, legumes, potatoes, starchy vegetables, starches, sugar, obviously, and even fruit until their levels, their labs show me that they can handle more fruit, or lower their protein content until their labs show me they can handle more, or lower or completely eradicate their dairy content until their labs show me otherwise. We don't guess in this population ever.
Right. Yes. How do you know? Like, I think one of the myths I hear about the keto, the low carb, high fat diet is that it's high protein. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, there's definitely what we call kind of internet keto and Atkins or modified Atkins keto. And yeah, those are definitely a higher protein content. That's actually a really good strategy, for instance, with someone is coming out of a major like surgery or recovery, or they just had a massive illness that really took them down a rabbit hole of some sort of their own health really deteriorating quickly. We might need a little extra protein in that window of time. But otherwise, for the cancer population, we tend to keep our protein levels between 0.8 and 1 grams per kilogram and keep it. So that's relatively considered a low to normal protein intake. And so really where we adjust is in the higher fat. Okay, so we really offset that a bit with that piece there. So knowing that it's not a high protein diet with regards to what we are studying in the cancer world, cancer research from the bench. So our colleagues out there like D'Agostino and Seafried and others, but I'm the person at the bedside. So I'm seeing the patient in real time. I'm looking at their labs in real time. I'm looking at what else is wrapped around their dietary interventions in real time. And to tell you that it's a population that needs a lot less protein to be able to serve the needs of actually fighting back a tumor process.
Wow, fascinating. One of the things I've often had in the back of my mind is I usually say to my clients, as long as it's a whole food, you're good to go. Like I've left them to work with nutritionists or to kind of figure out what meal plan might make sense to them. But my job is to get them off the processed stuff. That's job one. But under that criteria, when we look at oil, it doesn't qualify as a whole food, right? Something's been removed or something's been added. So what would you say to that?
Well, I'm definitely this person who has figured it out for myself and lots of others that food is where we need to go. However, I look at those oils as more like a supplement versus, this is actually the diet. So really we can't do so much of this with avocado oil, olives, olive oil, depending on your Snips, your single nucleotide polymorphism. Some people can handle a little bit more animal fat, animal fat such as lard, butter, ghee, or the animal fat in the meat itself. If folks have the ACSL1 SNP or if they have a POE3-4 SNPs, then we may push them more to like really dense nutrition in avocado and olive oil as their main fat source versus coconut oil and butter and animal fat sources. So we can even gently alter what a person needs individually. And so for me, when I look at some of those fats, because for some folks, they can't literally eat enough fat in their regular foods to hit their macronutrients, or they're dealing with some things like with cancer in particular, we start to change our food cravings and we start to change our food, our hunger patterns, especially as the cancer progresses. A lot of times our hunger goes away. And the worst thing that you could ever possibly do for a person with no appetite is force them to eat more fat. So something like kind of loading up on MCT oil can help them hit those macros, help them get into a state of metabolic flexibility. that is not going to take up as much valuable real estate as, say, eating, several eggs and some avocado butter and some avocado and, like putting all of that stuff into the mix. So it's got a time and a place for that, for sure. And my hope with folks is that they're always, trying to get it as much as they can with food, and then simply adjust accordingly with their needs if they're not hitting the ketone levels, or if they're not hitting their macronutrient levels, and especially if they're losing weight too quickly, which can also be a concern for somebody dealing with an oncology process.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Tell me a bit about the labs that you do. Like, is there too many to mention, or can you do some high level? What are some of the markers that you look for?
Sure. When I'm working with somebody for the first time, I like to take a bird's eye view to the overall terrain. Like, what am I looking at? Because the way I approach integrative oncology is, my oncology colleagues and researchers, they're looking at tumors and tumor cells. That's their interest. They're looking kind of through a funnel. I'm definitely interested in that. I want to see what they're seeing, but I want to also know what's wrapped around this. So where I start with labs is a basic blood chemistry, which is your blood count, white blood cells, red blood cells, platelets, neutrophils to lymphocytes, which are a breakdown of your white blood cell count. I then look at metabolic testing, which is like your basic CMP, your chem panel, which shows just liver, kidney function, electrolyte function. These two tests by themselves cost you about $20, $25 out of pocket to walk into a lab and run. So they're not expensive, provocative tests, and they can tell me a lot about somebody's overall condition, about their overall inflammatory processes, their overall immune response processes, the vitality of their organs, and even the way they're processing things through their body. So we can see a lot of information from those two simple, inexpensive tests. And then I look at what my patients have coined the trifecta. And the trifecta is each of these tests, I'll be ready to get these three that I'm going to tell you about, can tell us a lot of information individually, but as a collective in the oncology world, to me, they're more sensitive and specific and foreboding or for celebrating than scans and tumor markers. And that would be the C-reactive protein, which is a general marker of inflammation, the sedimentation rate, or ESR, which is a marker of how quickly our blood cells fall out of solution. So basically, the faster the blood cells fall out of solution, the healthier. So you want a lower number, because if it takes a while for those cells to kind of float down, that means you've got this kind of thick, sticky blood pattern that's creating kind of this matrix in the system that is kind of gumming up the works. Okay, and that's really, you see a lot of that in like autoimmunity, issues with cardiovascular health, issues with end-stage diabetic processes, and definitely we know that that sort of scaffolding, that matrix that happens with thicker blood, also is an encouraging way for cancer cells to crawl out of their original site and move about the building and take up habitat elsewhere. And then the third test, which we used to run routinely about 15 years ago, is the lactase dehydrogenase, LDH or LD. It's so funny how I'll order this test and doctors will routinely, mistakenly send me the LDL, which is part of the lipid panel. It drives me crazy because LDH is so much about what's going on at the level of the mitochondria. This is perhaps one of the most powerful tests we can look at for our mitochondrial metabolic health out there, and it's ignored. And if you even look at it in more nuanced of its 5 broken down isoenzymes, you can actually know the source of what is being attacked or where the damage is, whether it's bone, liver, lung, kidney, red blood cells, metabolic, tumor progression. So if you look up any of those 3 tests by themselves and just put in the search engine, LDH in cancer, or CRP in cancer, or Ceterate in cancer, you will see a load of information come up with any of them by themselves. So for me, functionally, when I look at these, I like them to be well in my range, because remember that labs are based on the average of the population, and we are not a healthy population. So do not compare yourself to the average. Make yourself an outlier. So for instance, a high sensitivity CRP should be below 1 or 0.1, depending on the lab. A Ceterate should be under 10, and an LDH should be under 175 or 450, depending on the lab. And so when all 3 of those are in the perfect place in my patients dealing with the cancer process, I don't care what the scan is showing or what the tumor markers are showing. I know that the patient's in the driver's seat. I know that their metabolic mitochondrial pathways and functionings are still stellar. I'm more concerned about the patients who have clear scans and perfect tumor markers that have trifectas that are all out of my normal range, a trifecta all out. that's when I know it's a matter of days, weeks, or months before the cancer is exploding far more aggressively. That what we're actually looking at is more of maybe a blueprint of what's going on with the stem cells, the circulating tumor cells, which are non-responsive to any of our standard of care interventions and are made much worse and more aggressive and less responsive to all treatments dealing with cancer when the body is bathed in a sugar-dense environment.
Wow. What about the Snips? Can you talk a bit more about Snips? What are they, and how do you what lab do you use to test for the genetic component of this?
Perfect. So a lot of folks, I remember when I started working with single nucleotide polymorphisms, epigenetics about 12, 15 years ago, nobody knew. It was like speaking Greek to somebody. But today, almost everybody have at least heard of something like 23andMe. Mm-hmm. Now, just to throw a little caveat in here, I stopped using 23andMe back in August 2017 when they got bought out by GlaxoSmithKline and basically filtered out the most clinically relevant information that I use as a clinician today. And they did that for very, you can make your own assertions as to why they did that, but it's benefiting the pharmaceutical companies, not our patients. So I stopped using them for that reason. In fact, they changed their platform such that a lot of the information I need as a clinician is no longer available. If you've used 23andMe since August 1st, 2017, if you're working with somebody like me, you're going to have to retest elsewhere to get the full picture. So today, because I'm very nutrient specific in the way I approach as a foundation, because my personal belief with a patient is chronically ill as a cancer patient, you cannot drive a car down the road on bad gas. So I want to use nutrition as the foundation in which we operate. Okay, so I use a company that I really trust and have used for several years now, nutritiongenome.com. So he can both do your test as well as the assessment, and he sends out a good 50, 60-page report that even the patient can really dive in and get a sense of themselves. But for somebody like me, I dive a little bit deeper into the specific RS numbers for each of the patients, and I get a sense of what's going to make this patient do better or do worse, just dependent on what medications, supplements, nutrients, dietary interventions, lifestyle interventions we're going to put into the mix. Because for instance, I'll use myself as an example. I have a very slow COMT, which is a catecholamine SNP, which basically means for me, in my background, stress kills, right? Stress is what drives most metastasis, being in a sympathetic nervous system dominant place, and catecholamine processes, COMT processes, is really behind the helm at that most of the time. And so where in the world of cancer, we tell everyone, drink your green tea, 6 to 8 cups a day, go for it, go, go, go. I was guzzling a gallon of green tea for years in my process. And it wasn't until I learned I'm a slow COMT SNP person that I realized I was actually increasing my estrogen dominance, increasing my catecholamine stress response from green tea. Something we're out there thinking is right. So that was very humbling. And the second I pulled green tea out of the mix, lots of things changed in my chemistry, right? Mm-hmm. Or for instance, my husband, who's been eating low carbohydrate with me for a long period of time, but he still loves his red meat a lot more than I do. But he was having a lot of blood sugar issues and he thought he just needed more protein. And I'm like, I don't think that's the case. Luckily, the Snips tell the truth, and it doesn't have to be my dogma, it doesn't have to be my belief system. And he has a homozygous ACSL1 SNP, which basically means when he eats red meat, he turns it right into sugar. That's a very specific time and place here. So we can get out of our own way and stop having kind of pissing wars between nutritional camps when we start to look at people's biochemical individuality. So for instance, the TCF7L2 SNP should probably have never eaten a grain in their entire life. You'd be shocked at how many people have that hiccup, right? And
really?
Mm-hmm. So we can really get a sense for folks. Then we, of course, look at their overall labs. Like we were talking about right before the show, I also get on everybody a vitamin D in an optimal range well above 50. In my cancer patient population, I usually keep it between 80 and 100. I also want to look at their hemoglobin A1C. I want that under 5. I look at their insulin. I want that around 3 or even less. And I look at an insulin growth factor, which is a big driver in most metastatic processes in cancer in general. And I want that down around 100, which will shock all of your bodybuilder world because they're shooting to get it higher for growth factors to build muscle. But guess what? When you're dealing with a cancer metabolic process, that loves to build tumor. not muscle, right? And in fact, it goes the opposite direction. The muscles start to waste and the tumor starts to gain. So that's why we have to look at these nuances of patient population, their Snips, their labs, their current state of health, their tumor burden, what treatments they're bringing on board, to help augment and support that. Is it a strategy that we want to fast them around their chemo? Is it a strategy that we want them in deep therapeutic ketosis when they go in for their radiation, so we can sensitize those cancer cells to the radiation? Because guess what? Insulin and glucose desensitize your cancer cells to radiation. And when you do radiation while you still have a high glycemic state, you are, of course, causing known carcinogenic DNA damage, which we know without a doubt radiation does, but you also make for more aggressive cancer stem cells that are more mutated and less responsive to any therapy you put in the future. So I'm always trying to know to take a breath, look at the big picture, look at a bigger view of your labs before you choose whatever therapy, conventional, integrative, or otherwise you do. You can make it work better for you.
Wow. Oh my gosh. What I really love about this is, I love when you said the words, we can end the diet wars. My heart wants to end the diet wars. We are doing a low carb, high fat partnership with Doug and Low Carb USA. And I'm so grateful because we've tapped into these brilliant minds and these scientists that are making connections between the high carb processed diet we've got. And I'm deeply grateful for all of the speakers. And at the same time, I know in my heart of hearts that there are people that are working, doing different things that are getting really exciting results as well. And maybe they can both be right. It depends on your Snips and your blood work and your...
Oh my gosh, I love that because maybe it's because I'm a Libra, I don't know. But guess what? We can all be right, and we can be right at different times. So maybe what's working for an individual right now in this moment, 3 months, 6 months, a year from now, a decade from now, may not be the case. So for instance, specifically to the cancer population, cancer cells, they mutate rapidly. Usually if you start a treatment of any kind, whether that was high dose IV vitamin C, whether that was a strict vegan diet, whether that was mistletoe, whether that was surgery or radiation, in about 6 months, those cells usually will find a way around, a workaround, and start to express again if you're not constantly looking under the hood and pulling out the weeds and amending the soil and giving the body what it needs at any given time. Because when you're diagnosed with a cancer diagnosis, you've been sick for a very long time, 8 to 10 years on average, unbeknownst to you. So you've been cultivating, you've been amending a soil that is creating sicker and sicker cells until it's big enough and loud enough to capture your attention. So there's no way you can heal from the same soil in which you got sick. So you have to let go of ego, and you have to be able to go dig your hands into that soil and figure out what's actually going on and adjust it accordingly. And then you'll get to a certain phase where you'll need to do more. And then you'll hit that plateau, and then you'll need to dig in again. This is an ongoing, lifelong process, because guess what? 70% of all patients who have had a diagnosis of cancer will have it come back. That's not my stat. That's the American Cancer Society stats. And the reason being is because no one is taught about their terrain. They're only focused on the tumor and the tumor cell. So a lot of these brilliant minded people out there doing the research, they're so great at eradicating the cancer and the cancer cells, but they've done nothing to change the terrain around it. And so that's why, of course, it can come back, or come back with a vengeance. Okay? It's frankly easy to kill cancer. It's difficult to keep it at bay.
Got you.
Yeah.
Oh, amazing. I'm going to say one quick thing, and then I'd like to dig in a bit more, because I know you've got 10 different sort of components of the train that I'd love to dig in there a little bit. I just wanted to say, back to the diet war piece, I have often wondered if Ancel Keys, I give people the benefit of the doubt, maybe too much. But I just think genuinely, like when something really worked for you and it's your burning truth, you are vegan and you're thriving. There's a woman named Rosita who's freaking glowing, and she does, do you know her?
I totally know her. Yep.
Oh,
yep. Of her. Yeah.
Yeah. And she's radiantly gorgeous, and her blood works great. And has a twin who's obese, and she argues that there were some genetic mutations that predispose people to not be able to respond well to saturated fat. So she's out there talking against saturated fat. But the thing is that that might be true for her, but maybe there's other people who don't get well till they eat saturated fat. And so anyways, it gets confusing, but I've often thought, once I heard her topic, I wonder if Ancel Keys was one of those guys that had the SNP that didn't respond to fat very well, to saturated fat, to a high fat diet. And he was biased by his own body truth.
Absolutely.
And it wasn't this nefarious, evil agenda to dupe the world. It was just this bias that happens in science more often than we like. But
I think you nailed it, because I can think of a handful of camps that are having and thriving. I mean, again, the way I look at labs, I would like to see people's, because that's just how my brain works. I'm a data-driven person and I'm a metrics gatherer. So I don't just say, hey, I feel great and look great, because guess what? Every person who comes to me with cancer says, I was healthy until I got cancer. No, you weren't. That's an impossibility. And let's start looking back at your labs and let me show you exactly where the train went off the tracks. So that's the places I tell people, if you are thriving on something, I'm really happy to hear that. And that does not take away your personal responsibility. You need to dig a little bit deeper and make sure that is in fact the case for you. Because we all know someone who was, the perfect athlete or a yogini or ate perfectly or whatever, who suddenly, quote unquote, comes down with a terrible cancer. Because as you alluded to a moment ago, this is a perfect time to segue in, we are just a bucket, which I think of like our mitochondria as a bucket. And in my 25 plus years of doing this, I've found about 10 major drops that go into that bucket, kind of paths or patterns or contributors to that mitochondrial health. So our blind spot is just that until it is made aware, until it is brought to our attention, to our awareness. So when I see someone who's done, like I exercise, I eat right, that's maybe they took care of 3 of the 7 components of the 10 components into their bucket, but there were still 7 that hadn't been deeply explored. So a quick rundown of what those droplets into your mitochondrial bucket would be. Number 1, the epigenetics, which is the concept of something that's been passed down to you from previous generations, where we used to say, hey, my dad had diabetes, my grandpa had diabetes, therefore I'm going to have diabetes and I'm a sitting duck and there's nothing I can do. Epigenetics is about the concept of above the gene, meaning you can't change that you have that gene, but you can change how it expresses. That's what's cool. So learning your blueprint through epigenetic testing, like nutrition genomes, you'll have a sense of kind of what deck of cards you were dealt, but you get to choose how to play that hand. That's what's so empowering. That's one bucket drop. The next drop is our glycemic state. I know you have so many great speakers in these last several years who've talked about this, but we were meant to be a hybrid engine. We were meant to be able to easily pop back and forth into burning sugar or burning fat. But basically since the 1850s, when we started processing sugar and flour and salt and putting it into everything, we went from about 5 pounds of sugar per year to, in 2014, study showed 175 pounds of sugar per year per person. We changed that and we basically put a brick on the accelerator pedal in the realm of sugar, which creates all kinds of issues, which you'll find out what else it impacts here in a moment into that bucket. But we've gotten stuck in sugar burning mode. And so when we talk today, like in your organization and others, about eating low carb, the irony of this is that's how we all ate before, say, 1850. And we kind of call it low carb today, but it was actually been normal carb all along. And so that's another dogma, like throw that out the window. It's not low carb, it's normal carb.
Oh my God, I gotta pause. That's so amazing. that really blows my mind.
Right? And to think about roughly when we look at some of our food, now definitely I know I can already hear the chatter coming out of it. What about this culture? What about this culture? You also have to look at the expenditure of their energy. You have to look at their climates. You have to look at these places they were in. But for the most part, us in the Western world today, we were eating normally about 30% of our diet was carbohydrate. Today, it's somewhere between 70 and 80% of our diet is carbohydrate. We've really changed gears in a really short period of time of human existence. Mm-hmm. So, and of course, stopped our physical, we don't use that fuel the way we did. And we're ingesting foods and chemicals and things in our environment they're making it even more challenging. So there we have that big little guy into the bucket of our glycemic status, our metabolic status of the energy we burn and the types of energy we make from the fuel sources we put in. That's a big player into that mitochondrial bucket. And so for instance, another piece specific to that is when folks are burning sugar, they are being less efficient and effective in their ATP production. And what happens is that mitochondria kind of get gummed up and really weakened with that over time. It kind of rusts them. I'm using very lay terms here. But when that happens, you have to remember that the number one way we fight, well, there's two ways we fight cancer mainly. Is one is known as apoptosis, which is programmed cell death, which is 100% under the activity, the quality, the quantity, the efficiency of our mitochondria. Right? So if our mitochondria aren't working, we're unable to kill cells that should have been cleaned out of the building a long time ago.
Wow.
That's huge. Okay. Apoptosis is driven by mitochondrial function.
Wow.
That's a biggie. Number two is our immune system, which is ironic because the way we treat cancer today is pretty much every which way you can to obliterate the immune system and then hope the person's alive on the other side. So, we are going about it a very different way. Third thing into that bucket, environment. Oof, this is such a biggie. In fact, I just came from an environmental health symposium, kind of a depressing conference every year, but you have to hear this information. And that we now have things like metalloestrogens, which is basically things like mercury and cadmium drive up estrogen dominance. And when your estrogen is dominant, so is your cortisol. And when your cortisol is dominant, so is your glucose. So you could be eating the perfect diet, but if you're a stress monger, right? Or if you are taking exogenous hormones, okay, meaning well, so you can slide through perimenopause elegantly, and you have particular Snips, your body thinks it's eating 20 candy bars, it's revving in that same place. So I always talk about sugar, sex, and stress are the key. They all create the same response in the system. They all push each other up. Right? You don't want that. You don't want high cortisol. You don't want high estrogen. You don't want high sugar. All of them are growth factors and create all kinds of problems in that mitochondrial bucket. And then we have things like your microbiome, which I know your folks have talked about the impacts of sugar on the microbiome. We have like your immune system. Certainly you've had people talk about the fact that even a single teaspoon of sugar can completely depress your natural killer cells for 7 hours, 1 teaspoon. And most of us are ingesting 17 to 20 teaspoons of sugar a day on average.
Wow.
Right. And so it's like, of course you don't have a functioning immune system. And no wonder we're all sick from basically Halloween until Valentine's Day, right? Because it's like one sugar festival after another at the time when our vitamin D levels are at their lowest, when we're all closed up and not getting fresh air and lots of good light exposure. And then we're just plowing ourselves full of sugar. It should be called the sugar season instead of the cold and flu season, because we would not get the cold and flu if we were not basically celebrating our lives and spiritual practices through massive consumption of sugar for a chunk of time during the darkest, coldest time of the year with the lowest levels of vitamin D. And then of course we have on the vitamin D notion, that is all about our immune function. Most of us are severely deficient thanks to soaping up. Right? So soap today is actually a detergent. It takes 3 days to synthesize vitamin D in your skin. So I tell my patients, pits and parts, people, that's the only place you use your soaps is on your pits and parts.
Oh my gosh.
Just loofah, scrub it down, water by itself so you can synthesize all that goodness into your cells. Cool, right?
Yeah, I had no idea.
Right? And if you're a person who doesn't eat pastured eggs or doesn't eat grass-fed butter, or doesn't eat back lard, you're not getting the other co-fat. You're not getting the vitamin A, the D, the K. You're not getting all of those fats. That's where we got it before from our animal products. And if you're totally lathering up and going outdoors and avoiding the 10 to 2 window, you're not synthesizing the 10,000 units a day you need on average just to maintain. That's not therapeutic levels. That's prevention of, osteomalacia and all kinds of other conditions. So these are the places there. And then again, we talked about inflammation earlier, hugely driven by sugar. Angiogenesis, the concept of new blood vessels growing towards a tumor that's starving the rest of the body and feeding the tumor. But also within that category, we also have circulation in general and oxygenation. So most of us sit on our duffs all day long. We're not moving enough. We're not oxygenating enough. And cancers love low oxygen environments. So if you're not exercising, you are basically allowing a cancerous process to take root even more. And then the final, we talked about hormones. We've talked about stress response. And the big one is our mental, emotional health. Because if we're not in the mental game around this as well, sort of everything topples. I mean, you think about the concept of a depressed person. They typically have depressed immune function. They are reaching for foods that will give them kind of a dopamine or a serotonin hit, which is typically sugar. Okay, for the dopamine, or serotonin, it's like potatoes, high starchy vegetables, and legumes and roots. We're reaching for those. And so we're just kind of keeping ourselves in a stuck place, like a hamster on a wheel. So when I look at these patients that come to me and said, I did everything right, I'm like, well, let's take a 10-part questionnaire with 10 questions in each. And then you tell me if you were doing everything right. And I'm here to tell you, I've not had a single person come back and say, it's perfect, So our first part of our book is very much that do the screen for yourself. Then throughout the book, we talk about the labs, which I've already alluded to. Look at those labs. Get the truth. Don't guess. You don't have to guess anymore. And then you really know what you're starting with. You know what's in the soil, and then you know what to do about it.
And is your book that complete? Like I confess I haven't read it yet. In fact,
it's overly complete. I'll be honest. It's a juicy little nugget.
Okay. So
Yeah.
is it the kind of thing where people can DIY their way through it?
Well, I tell you, I didn't expect that. When I wrote this book, it was pretty much a place to download 25 years at that time in my brain. It was based out of, this book was written from the cancer retreats I had held for many, many years. So in 4 days, we'd get pre-labs. We'd have patients come starting on a Friday afternoon. They'd leave on a Monday afternoon. And we'd get post-labs a week or two later. And we would be able to show them that in 4 days, we could basically change their entire terrain. And so from that, and at the education, the weekend is deeply immersed in living it, but also being educated about it and being empowered about it. And most of the folks who came to these conferences were stage 4 cancer patients. Okay. And so what they would say is, that was like drinking water out of a fire hydrant. Can we do more? I would give them like a little notebook with 200, single pages of notes from the weekend, and they'd write their own notes into it. And that notebook and those retreats is what became the book.
Amazing.
And then filled out. We have over 300 scientific references. Each chapter talks about what else can you be doing? What labs could you be looking at? What foods would support this, or supplements, or therapies that are out there that can support this particular pattern for you. So we even have patients who said, I did the questionnaire at the beginning, and there were 2 areas that I needed to focus on in the priority, and those are the only 2 chapters I read in your whole book. And I'm like, awesome. Now, after a few months, go back and redo that questionnaire because it'll have changed. Suddenly you're like, oh, now this one's the highest. Go focus on that chapter for a while. And so it's pretty juicy. It's pretty extensive, but it's very helpful. And I've had people tell me, I kind of thought my mom and maybe a couple patients would buy it. It's kind of gone crazy worldwide, 5 languages, 2 more coming out this year.
You're kidding me.
I'm not kidding. I had no idea. I did not. First of all, no one writes a book to make money. Please know that, folks. It's a way for me to not have to say the same damn thing over and over again.
Totally.
Cool. And then the fact that it touched so many. And when I talk to colleagues in particular, medical doctors, there's medical doctors at major medical universities and institutions who make my book require reading for their patients. That's pretty cool to me. Because it helps them do their job better. Right?
Yes.
The other thing is I'll be someplace, and I was just at a huge benefit for a Johns Hopkins trial that I consult on regularly on mistletoe for cancer. And I had a man come up to me and say, I was stage 4 melanoma. I read your book. I applied everything in your book, and I'm no evidence of disease right now. So talk about do it yourself. I hear stories like that every single day. I get beautiful letters, comments, updates, Facebook messages, people at conferences coming up to me, colleagues sending, hey, this helped my mom. It's so gratifying. I had no idea. I didn't expect that it could help people just at that level. So to me, that shows we're onto something, because I'm looking at a lot more than just the tumor and the tumor cell. I'm looking like, what is in your bucket? That is ultimately what we're doing. And so that's why it forces us out of the dogma camp, right? because we need different things at different times and we have different priorities at different times. And guess what? Our metabolic health, we have all these folks focusing on doing low sugar or no sugar for cancer. As I said before, if you're having a perfectly ketogenic diet, but you're not sleeping, guess what? 2 nights of bad sleep raises your insulin growth factor. It's like that you just kind of pissed in the wind right there, right?
Yeah.
If you're constantly under high stress and you're in a terrible relationship or a job you hate, you're revving cortisol, which means you're revving your sugars no matter what, or that you're taking still maybe, because you want to still feel young and vital and juicy, maybe you're taking your exogenous hormones. And guess what? That is pushing all the growth factors, in your body. And so there's so many other ways to address what's in that bucket safely, and to also know that your metabolic health depends on a lot more than what you put into your mouth.
Right. It's like it's necessary, but not sufficient.
Exactly. It's a foundational component for certain, because I've also had the other end of the spectrum of people like, I do everything perfectly. I have, blue blockers and which I'm wearing right now. I'm like, everyone's like, I sleep perfectly and I get out in the sun every morning. I work out and I don't have any toxicants and I have an air filter and I drink it, but I eat whatever I want. Because there's actually people out there are camps that say food doesn't matter.
Right.
And the only thing that matters is, say, light exposure or whatever. Bullshit, guys, excuse me. But it's like, there is no way you can't look at all these pieces and parts to make a better, make things work better. And maybe at different times you need a priority of one of them might be what you put your attention to, but you will certainly have to address all of it eventually.
Right. Amazing. Amazing.
Yeah.
One thing that struck me, this is going back a little bit, is the idea that people come to you to say, I'm doing everything right and I feel great. I was great until I got cancer. And I know that I've had this conversation with my teenager who she's like, yeah, I don't know. She has these slumps where she's been eating junk food with all of her friends and she feels terrible. And it's all of it out of the blue for her. She's like, suddenly I can't sleep, Mom, and my skin's cranky and I'm feeling flat and I kind of discouraged about my future, right? And I know she's crashed, but to her, in her mind, it's a one-off.
Yes.
And I explained to her that, honey, you're eating all these crappy foods and you're not sleeping and you're partying on the weekends and you're not really caring for your body and whatever. Those times that you're feeling good are because you're using substances that override the body telling you, I'm not feeling good.
Yeah,
I'm not feeling good. I really need some help here, right? I'm not getting the nutrition and the sleep and the exercise and the sunshine and all those things that I need. But she can't tune into it because she's on chocolate and Starbucks.
Totally.
And it matters.
Bing, 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 blue screen
bing,
time.
bing, the serotonin and
a lot of likes on Facebook.
totally.
I was like, I feel good. I feel good. I feel good until I don't.
Until it finally has a breakthrough moment. And then she thinks that when she lays low for a little bit, and then she gets back on the things that are hitting her dopamine and her serotonin and her catecholamines and her GABA and whatever, right? And anyways, but I just wanted to make that comment because you don't really know how bad you feel till you get off of the stimulants and the drug like foods and caffeines and stuff, that all of a sudden you get it down to ground zero and you go, oh.
Exactly. And I love that you brought that up because it seems like that is just a part and parcel for being a teenager. But you just described 98% of the North American population, actually probably all Western world, Western civilization, right? So that is the case, because I'll have people say, well, I never got sick until I quit smoking. And then I'm like, it's because the cilia woke up again after being paralyzed for 30 years and started flapping the way they're supposed to and started moving that muck out of the body, restored its natural function. And now all the years of tar and gunk you've had in there is working its way up and out, and it feels awful. So that's just one example. It's the same thing with sugar, because guess what? Sugar withdrawal is no different than cocaine withdrawal, than opiate withdrawal. It's the exact same centers of the brain being hit. So people feel good, or think, like you said, they overcompensate and think they're feeling good on it until they take it out. And the problem is just that in-between window. Because when you're in that zone, it's pretty miserable. So I really coach and support folks. That's why it was fun to do these 4-day intensive retreats, because we were there doing everything to help them slide through that section very, very quickly. And they didn't even know. We didn't tell them this is this is how you're eating. And if you start to feel this, we've got this, this, and this. We didn't tell them what until after. They learned after the fact to realize, oh, when they go home and like try and get their family member to do it with them without the same level of support that we did in those 4-day immersions, those people are like cursing them, right? Because you're going through carbohydrate withdrawal. It's a thing. And so if people can move and trust that they will get through it, because everyone's sort of threshold is different. It might take, one person 24 hours. It might take somebody else 24 days, right? Everyone's metabolically wired differently. So as we were saying before the recording, I'm to the point now of metabolic flexibility that I can eat a pint of berries and it does nothing to my ketones or to my blood sugar levels or to my insulin or my hemoglobin A1C. My husband would eat 2 and everything is like, forget about it, totally out of range. So we're all a bit wired differently. So you have to honor that biochemical individuality, but you're right. A lot of folks think they're doing okay because they're still addicted to what was giving them that false sense of security.
Yes, that false sense of well-being. And I love the message as well that you've been on a journey of just getting better and better and making tweaks and then taking it to the next level. And then now the beans and the grains are gone. And now I'm looking at my ketones and now my blood work's the best it's ever been. And what's great about that is that now you're able to go back to the blueberries and you go back to
yes, yeah.
Right. And that these people starting out their journey and they look way far out and they think, I'll never get to eat blueberries again, and they just have
a glass of dry farmed wine or a keto margarita. Like it's shocking how quickly you can overcome. I learned the hard way because I didn't have Dr. Google. There were not bajillions of bloggers and researchers out there and summits like this to my disposal. I had to figure it out one painful mistake at a time over decades, right? So today we can definitely move through that process much quicker. It won't take you 27 and a half years. It might take you 27 and a half days to figure out what works for you. And then know that, for instance, TMI, but I'm now moving into my perimenopause place and I'm watching all my girlfriends in the same age flipping out, symptomatic, all kinds of issues going on. And I'm like, am I missing something? Did I not get that memo? Because this is actually a totally different experience for me. In fact, I'm like celebrating. I'm excited about it. I'm like, oh, yay, this is so awesome. And so it's like we've even sort of created an expectation that it's going to be terrible to move into these other phases of your life. And it doesn't have to be. And when you start to recognize that things like lectins, for instance, in a lot of our grains and legumes and a lot of foods can actually kick up things like histamine. And histamine is a big driver of things like hot flashes. Okay. So that's a big one. Or that blood sugar, holy cow, we talked about how the interrelationship of blood sugar, stress, and sex hormones are so intertwined. My girlfriends are like chugging a half a bottle of wine every night just to cope with the stress of their day, which is tweaking their hormones and their blood sugar even more, because I guarantee it's not dry farmed wines of any sort, that are removed of glyphosate and whatnot. Like that's the thing that we keep putting in and we're like, gosh, I don't understand. I must just need a pill or a cream or a testosterone patch or something to get my mojo back. I'm like, no, it's more about taking crap out of your bucket versus putting more in most cases.
Yes. Awesome.
Yeah.
Do you still do retreats?
After the book came out, that took a lot of energy. So
yes.
Where I was doing several retreats, anywhere from 6 to 20 retreats a year for many years, that time is now used to be basically up on stages at medical conferences and summits and whatnot now. So I miss it though, because first, that's such a powerful way to connect with another human being. It's incredibly gratifying to watch how these other people connect with each other. They find support. They see changes in real time. So it is coming back. I was hoping to do one in the fall of 2019, but my dance card got pretty full of some conferences I'm presenting worldwide this year, which is great to see that this conversation is global. When we used to look at, say, oh gosh, well, Asia doesn't have the same cancer rates that we do. Guess what? They do now, because they're eating the way we eat. That's just it. They're like a bunch of sugar junkies just like us. So it's changing, the playing field that we're all kind of equalizing, the court. So now I'm being invited to speak in all these other places along these lines, but I miss it. I love it. And my hope is to start doing them again in 2020. I'd like to be able to do 2 or 3 a year. And that's already, we have a giant wait list of people saying, when you bring them on again, I want in, including people who've done multiple ones with us.
Yes.
really powerful because you get to see it and feel it in real time. And even if you're there, if you already understood it for yourself, to witness another experience it for the first time is incredibly powerful. Yeah.
Yes. And you know where my head is going with this, Nasha, is just because I'm a mom of a teenager who's struggling and suffering, and it breaks my heart. And she'll pull out, but I just think that I would love to get to teens. And I've been thinking for years. Let me tell you my idea.
Let's do it.
Okay, I've been thinking for years about all these kids that go away for summer camps. And wouldn't it be awesome? They're off of school and they can go through a process of detoxifying and getting familiar with their labs and their blood chemistry, and like geek out on them and their bodies and get them so excited about how great they can feel together. And they're going to feel crappy for a while, and then move them through a week or 2 week camp and then in the mountains and have them have fun and do canoeing and all the other fun things.
My wheels are turning so much because we already have people out there doing sort of like an outward bound type of program. They're very great for young people and very much geared towards outdoor life and adventure.
Yeah.
We also then have like these wellness camps. We really don't have the deep merger of what you're talking about, like a true prevention of chronic illness mixed with adventure, out there. I love that idea. So I think we got to get your listeners to kind of say, hey, we'd be in, sending our family member or our loved one, because I think what's happened, for instance, because I've been working with families for many generations as well. And in fact, I got a text right before we went on of a young woman who, she started seeing me begrudgingly at 13. A lot of health issues, PCOS, endometriosis, depression, angsty kind of type. If she's listening, she'll crack up because now she's probably one of my biggest cheerleaders. But now that she's moving into her late 20s and she's watching all of her friends her age that made fun of her for years of the way she ate and how she was doing things. They're now she's like got friends her age now. They're being diagnosed with terminal cancers or extremely debilitating chronic, autoimmune conditions, or frankly, just blowing their brains out because their brains aren't working because of everything they're being met with. It's devastating. It's devastating because guess what? The next generations are sicker than the previous.
Yes.
We know this from World Health Organization that any child born after 1980 is not expected to outlive their parents. Mm-hmm. It is going to take exactly what you just outlined to start to change that. We have to empower and inspire our young people to know they're in control.
Yes. That's my mission. I totally hear you.
I love it. Let's do this, Florence. We're in.
Okay, we'll talk after.
Yeah, I love it. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you so much for all your amazing information. And I just love that it isn't, because I feel like through this interview, if I was listening to it and I didn't know you have a book, I'd want to just book you or coach with you or right? And I know you're limited. So I'm glad that you've created a book that you can share you and your wisdom and with the world. So thank you so much for doing that. Do you have any final words of wisdom or last parting words you'd like to share with our audience who might be out there hooked on sugar, struggling and suffering? I always say to my clients, I know that nobody gives up sugar unless they have a really good reason, because who the heck would give up Black Forest cake and ice cream? Who would do that? Nobody. They have to have a really good reason. So I know they've got one. So what would you say to them for parting words?
Well, it's interesting, and you've probably heard this from some of your other presenters, that one thing that we really focused in on specifically when we were in retreat and when I had the opportunity of working one-on-one with clients, and now I'm working one-on-one with doctors to teach them how to work with their clients. So we're trying to back it up so that they can reach more people, as well, is that when we're looking for sugar, we're actually looking for something we're missing in our lives. Okay. So we're looking for sweetness that's not there. Whether it's in relationship, whether it's passion or purpose, whether it's that you can't find your joy in other places or that you can't tap into your gratitude. And so I always work with clients to ask them the 3 questions. What brings you joy? For what are you grateful? And what did you come here to do? What is your life purpose? And you'd be shocked, at least in the chronic illness realm, that those answers don't come very easily. And so it's no wonder that we'll often reach for these quick, sweet fixes to feed the lack of sweetness in our life. Mm-hmm. And so my hope is that folks, through things like summits and retreats and these types of things, they start to find that little glimmer, that little pilot light within them that can reconnect to the sweetness of life.
Oh, Oh my gosh, you're going to make me cry. Thank you so much. That was absolutely beautiful. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
All the best.
Bye-bye, everybody.